very much, Makeda. It's a pleasure to be here today, and especially at the beginning of a new COP. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. Mm, The aim of this event on inclusive future, um, which we are doing today, will have a number of uh, accessible guidelines which you will be seeing. You will see the captions, and you will also be, if you can see the CCC, you can turn on those, and you can see the also the side by side also. You can give your questions in the QA. The recorded will be, transcript will be provided to you. What is the disability innovation life that we're talking about today that you're going to see is sharing knowledge and experiences in disability innovation. This is part of the work that is done by GDI. It's a program which has been put together by the Global Disability Innovation Hub, as well as there are other people who have supported it. The ADB, for instance, is there. And we will also be sharing stories and innovations and the people behind the product, because experiences count, the informal space for ideas and reflections. And we look forward to your feedback. The Research and Practice Center drives the disability innovation for a fairer world. That is what we are looking for, and that is what today's meeting, even COP, is about. It was born out of the London 212 Paralympic legacy, community interest company, and academic research center at the University College of London. It has a huge program in 35 countries and will reach 21 million people by 2022. I'm Asha Hans. I live in India. I'm the Executive Vice President of SMRC, an academic, and a founder of the Women with Disabilities India Network. I'd like to say a few things about the program that we are going on to today and on the 11th, when I'm so happy that disability will be included in the COP. The event of this, the aim is to explore and put forward strategies of why we need inclusion of disability. And today, urban resilience in cities and climate change, especially issues of disabled in low resource urban areas, and provide evidence-based good practices. I come from India. We have been a member of the UNFCCC, SMRC, for the last number of years, but disability is still at the rock bottom. Very little has moved, except a little bit from the Paris framework that took place in 2015. Most of you might have heard of the IPC report that came out, the 6th assessment report. It has shaken everyone, all across the countries, but except maybe the states who are still negotiating or trying to negotiate what, where, and what they get out of this COP, because it's going to affect each of us. And where we are concerned, the failures of the climate policies which have been there will be something that will affect us, and maybe what the IPCC says, it leads to a planetary disaster. So this is a rare moment which we must later remember as a lost opportunity if we do not. And I think if GDI had not come up with this program, it would be something that we would later think back and say, why didn't we do it? The COP26 is still in the negotiation and on mitigation and stage, where they're talking about emissions to bring down. Basically, emissions are, what they're talking about is the emissions from carbon that, or the carbon footprints that are there. They would like that to come down as far as possible to a zero level, which looks like it's going to take another decade. So when we look at disability and we want it to be included and it is not being included, I think what we need to do is look at intersectionalities, because intersectionalities are not only of disability, there are also intersectionalities which are there of COP itself, of the kind of climate change that we're looking at, whether it is arid zones or whether it is we are looking at deltas, civilizations, where there are huge cities that were there and are no longer, do not exist. And most of these are because of climate change. We have seen many of these in the mountains. You see the Arctic melting and affecting many countries who are now trying to come up with new programs. But despite this, you will see that though Finland has a program on accessibility on disability and a program on climate change, so does Singapore. But these are in silos, they never intersect. And that is why I think there's a lot of change that we need. There has to be good practices. We'll be hearing from them, from Indonesia, from a number of countries that who will be joining us today. So finally, what we need to do is that we need to see that, I'll come to that later, that out of your experiences, we need to put before COP what we need to do in the next few years, especially on urban resilience. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I will now call upon is an associate director at UCL and also at GDI Hub. She will speak on disability and on climate change. Maria, the floor is yours.
Please, can you unmute yourself, Maria?
Sorry, schoolboy error there. Sorry, everyone. So I have been asked to give an overview of what some of the issues are that we're talking about here, to contextualize the work we'll be presented with later. So I'm basing this on work that we've been doing over the last number of years, really, both with the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office with the UK government and more recently with the Open Society Foundation. And both those reports should be available online. And these are just some issues and challenges that I think hopefully we'll start to see being addressed. We know that people with disabilities are amongst the most at risk from the impact of climate change. That's not because of impairments per se, but we know about the links between disability and poverty. Poorer people tend to have more vulnerable employment, and they tend to live in more precarious housing and be less able to adapt and adjust to things like extreme weather events. So that puts people with disabilities in the most at-risk group. Our research has shown that people with disabilities often lack knowledge about climate change, and that's not necessarily that they aren't aware about it, but have other priorities that need to be dealt with, including food and livelihoods. Sorry, not change the slide yet, please. Can you take the slide back? So we know that climate-focused services, including information, have tended to, as Ash has already alluded to, inadvertently perhaps exclude people with disabilities. They may be inaccessible, the information may not be in a variety of formats, or there's just been a lack of awareness around issues, which is interesting because oftentimes as Ash has also alluded to, the idea of social transformation that the climate justice movement is fighting for is very similar to that of the disability movement. We know the impacts of climate change can exacerbate existing impairments and disabilities and create new ones. This again has been research that's come up for things like the Lancet Climate and Health Commissions, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. We also know that people with disabilities and their representative organisations of people with disabilities tend to have lacked representation within climate forums and at the UN level. For example, there's very little mention of disability in the Paris Agreements, and likewise there's very little mention of climate change or no mention of climate change in the CRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Obviously this is starting to change a little bit. Go to the next slide, please. So the impact on people with disabilities, particularly around health issues. And I guess it's not just about health issues per se, but it obviously that climate events can disrupt social protection, they can disrupt social systems, support networks, access to healthcare, and those things, we know when there are times of disruption that things like your family support networks lose, you can be more vulnerable to other things like sexual and gender-based violence. We also know that increasing climate temperatures are reducing yield reductions for crops and increasing extreme weather events. We also know, unfortunately, that there's a lot of extreme weather events are leading to infrastructure destruction and habitat destruction and relocation. This is an interesting area. There's been very little research done around the impact specifically on people with disabilities around relocation and opportunities to relocate and linked to the migration issues. And again, I hope that that's something we'll have some discussions around. We of course know that climate change is leading to water stress, and that is having an impact on livelihoods, economic damage, and around agriculture, farming, fisheries, and increased pollution, which again, in turn, can have health impacts. And we also know increasingly that many countries now are seeing the need to migrate because of climate-related issues. And again, some of those, the issues around migration can be very challenging for people with disabilities. They're not necessarily being included in the discussions around the right to migrate. And of course, all of these issues can be attenuated in urban areas, as we'll hear. Next slide, please. Our research has really shown a number of factors, and that is a very systemic exclusion from many of these discussions, and that has led people with disabilities to focus on immediate priorities such as disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management rather than longer term climate focused actions. This is a really interesting point because there is quite a number of frameworks now to address disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Where they intersect with climate is perhaps up for discussion, and perhaps some, there are some opportunities to think differently about how, for example, funding for disaster risk management is allocated with regards to climate and disability. We also know that to date, there have been few effective partnerships between people with disabilities and their organisations and the climate movement. That is slightly and slowly changing. I read just recently, there's the Global Green Grants Foundation, Ford Foundation, etc., are starting to address this. Can we go back? But there's still a massive gap around understanding of issues. We know, it's very trite to bring up the issues of things like accessible and inclusive transport, sustainable transport versus accessible and transport, but we know there is a need for capacity building about issues on both sides. Asha touched on the intersectional aspects of the climate disability nexus, and I think this is a really important point to highlight. In the research we've done to date, there's very little that looks at this across the life course, for example, the impact on children or older people, for example, and Asha touched upon where people live, the locations. So again, these intersectional issues need to be unpacked and researched and understood much more systematically than they have been to date. And I guess this is an obvious, it's to think that climate response actions don't unintentionally exclude people with disabilities. I've touched upon this. So some of the let's say sustainable or other responses haven't always been disability inclusive, and it maybe is unintentional, but it needs to be much more dialogue and discussion around how they can be inclusive. And the final point is around the climate justice processes. A lot of the movements, the climate movement, the disability movement, are all focusing on the idea of a just society, a just transition. We need to have a transformation in society to ensure full economic and social inclusion. And I think that's partly linked to the paradigm shift that the CRPD is also pushing for. So we need to really think about how those justice movements can be brought together more closely. And the final point, so again, Asha touched upon what would a just COP26 look like. Next slide, please. So I think we've had some success about bringing disability to COP previously. We've had some side events, but they have been side events. They're not fully on the agenda. Disability hasn't really been front and center. I don't think we're not arguing for special, specific, people with disabilities don't have, separate needs to everyone else, but they need to be included in those discussions in the same way that women and Indigenous groups have been. Disability needs to be considered as a key intersectional issue throughout COP negotiations. And again, that's to really underscore that intersectional point. I think a lot of the work today has really focused on, in the climate movement, certainly, a lot of the work has focused on disability, or people with disabilities as a vulnerable group. And we really need to move away from this idea that people with disabilities are vulnerable per se. We know that they can be in situations that are vulnerable, which need to be addressed more fully, but it's not because they're disabled per se. So we need to really think about what the specific needs and rights are of persons with disabilities. And then, of course, the final point, we know that people with disabilities need to be active participants in climate action, not just passive recipients of things being done for them and to them. So it's again the mantra about nothing about us without us. So that's just a very quick run through of some of the issues around persons with disabilities in the climate justice and climate movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for giving a broad overview of what we should discuss today. And I think you touched upon very important issues like migration, where usually what I have seen is that all disabled people, whether they are children or adults, get left behind, and most of them as part of single-headed households. Water stress creates a lot of issues and a lot of gender roles, because as water is being started to be sold and bought rather than belonging to the community, there are new changes which are affecting persons with disabilities. Fishery, because of the sea that are getting hot, they are dying in many parts of the planet. That is another issue which is very important. Then the most important, of course, is the dialogue. What is COP26 talking about? They're still talking about zero, what we are going to reach in terms of emission. The social part is lacking. And that is where we have to come in. And you're very, very true that we have to be participants in that process. Thank you so much, Maria. You can put your questions in the question answer box, please. Now the next speaker is a very young Michaela Patrick, who has been helping to organize this session. She is an inclusive design researcher at GDI Hub and will be talking about inclusive design and resilience. Thank you, Michaela. Over.
All right, thanks, Asha, and hello, everyone. So Maria's given a great overview of disability, inclusion, and climate change. But now I want to introduce a topic that GDI Hub is increasingly interested in, which is the inclusive design of climate resilience. We believe that inclusive design is currently an untapped resource for climate resilient futures, and we'll be using our side event at COP, which will be on the 11th of November, to set an agenda for the inclusive design of climate resilient cities. So the design and planning of the urban built environment and infrastructure has a crucial role in a more equitable and resilient future. SDG 11 calls to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable for all. But we really need practical tools to be able to deliver on this. Practical tools and design approaches that help us design well for both people and planet. We think that the inclusive design of sustainable development solutions will create opportunities for resilience and ensure that marginalized groups are not left behind. It will also ensure that disabled people are included in conversations about climate resilient futures. So we say that inclusive design can ensure that everyone can experience the world around them in a fair and equal way. But inclusive design also needs to be sustainable, just as much as sustainable design needs to be inclusive. And we really need more examples of what this looks like. So we're gathering our partners and our networks to share examples of what climate resilient inclusive design might look like. And this is so that we can create an agenda for a more inclusive future. If inclusive design solutions aren't designed with sustainability or resilience in mind, over time their capacity to support inclusion will diminish, and that's something we really don't want to happen. So I wanted to share some examples from our research that have led us to think about climate resilience inclusive design. These examples come from our UK aid-funded 80-20-30 programme, specifically the Inclusive Infrastructure sub-programme, which is looking at inclusive city design in different cities around the world, in countries like Mongolia, India, Indonesia, Kenya and Sierra Leone, all working with local partners, which you can see here on the map. The first example is about inclusive and good quality road infrastructure. Good quality roads should both support mobility and access and also provide things like good drainage, which is crucial in cases of flooding or adverse weather events. These images show two examples of roads in poor conditions. In Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, a road in an unplanned settlement that surrounds the city is steep and unpaved, which is difficult to navigate in good weather conditions and treacherous in conditions of rain, snow, or ice. Then in the image on the right in Nairobi in Kenya, you can see here a road in the city centre where congestion is building up because the road is blocked by rubble and flooding. The previous images started to talk about the importance of good drainage, which is also an issue for inclusive environments and ensuring access. These two images here show how a lack of drainage or open drains can be a barrier for people with visual impairments. The first image on the left in Nairobi shows how an open drain along an alleyway in an informal settlement could be quite hazardous to navigate, particularly for someone with a visual impairment. The second image on the right in Ulaanbaatar shows how areas of flooding can be hard to navigate when you're using a white cane. This participant also told us how the poor road conditions were frequently damaging his assistive technology, increasing the need for either repairs or replacements, which again is another sustainability and resource challenge. The next example is about inclusive housing and buildings. All the buildings in these images don't have step-free access, some due to climate mitigation measures. Two of the buildings are raised above the ground for flood protection, and then one is lower level, so the level of the building is lower than ground level, which is a flood risk. The image on the right in Varanasi shows a huge access barrier. To enter the building, there are 3 narrow steps, as the building is raised up above the ground for this flooding protection. But before you even enter the building, there is a wooden plank that's being used to support people crossing an open drain. These kind of interventions in the built environment may support some people, but they're not accessible for disabled people. We want to make sure that infrastructure that's designed to support climate resilience is not creating more barriers. It should be supporting access and inclusion. These last examples here show why we need inclusive design in climate resilient design. This drain cover on the left in Nairobi should be built to maintain level access, whereas currently it's not. And the intervention on the right is looking at the gaps in Varanasi, which is a stepped heritage site along the river Ganges, where the city government is currently developing plans to ensure accessibility. But as you can see from this image, any intervention placed here to support accessibility and inclusion is also going to have to consider things like changing water levels from the river. So you can see the water is actually rising up above the steps in this image. I think at COP, there's going to be a lot of discussion about retrofitting buildings for climate resilience, building new infrastructure to support climate resilience. And we want to make sure that these discussions, these new ideas, these designs for retrofitting also incorporate inclusive design so that we can ensure that inclusion and resilience are supported or designed and resolved together at once. Thanks very much.
It's really cross-world issues that you have brought, that they are part of, it's a global issue, it's not in one place or the other. And I can give a very small example of World Bank, which had set up cyclone shelters, which they made them accessible, but they were on a coastal erosion space. So finally, when the sea comes up, you cannot access them. So, these are things that hotspots have to be checked before all these things are done. My next speaker is Lloyd Wright, who's a senior urban development specialist at the Asian Development Bank, and he will be speaking. One of the best practices that he will be putting forward is through sustainable and inclusive infrastructure at the Karachi Bus Rapid Transit Red Line project. Welcome. Over.
Well, thank you, Asha. Hello, everyone. I'm very flattered, Asha, that you're putting us out there as a good practice example. Hopefully, we can live up to this. Next slide, please. Our Karachi Bus Rapid Transit project is a $500 million project to create a mass transit corridor in one of the largest cities of the world that has no formal public transport. Next slide. But it's so much more really than just a mass transit system. Every single one of the images that you see on the screen is a theme and a subsector in the project. We like to think of this as really an urban transformation project that happens to also deliver a mass transit system. We find there's a lot of synergies between each one of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and therefore adding each one of these produces a much more robust project. Next slide. We've been very fortunate to work with a non-governmental organization in Pakistan called the Pak Everbright Development Organization, a disability rights NGO. And it really makes a difference in your project design to have a perspective from the disability community who have insights, not just on disability, but also on the really important local context. Next slide. So the example you see up there is one of our other projects that recently completed in Pakistan in the city of Peshawar. And I think what we've been successful to do is to create a barrier-free, universally accessible experience from the time a person leaves their home to when they reach their destination. But that really requires thinking through every stage of the trip, from the urban environment to entering a station, to buying a ticket, to getting through the gate, to getting to the platform, onto the vehicle, and onwards. Next slide, please. We're also looking at inclusion in a much broader sense. And one of the historically disadvantaged groups in Pakistan have been women who have been reluctant to use public transport because of harassment and security being one of the principal areas. And what we found that simple solutions, like simply creating a doorway with a dedicated queuing space for women, takes down a lot of the pressure and anxiety that women face when traveling. Next slide. Likewise, creating a space inside the public transport vehicles dedicated to women makes a huge difference in terms of reducing incidences of harassment. Crowding is one of the principal causes of harassment of women, and why in this particular city, Peshawar, before this project, only 10% of the ridership in public transport were women because of the challenges that women faced. And just in the 1 year that this project has been ongoing, we're now seeing the ridership level of women up to 40% of ridership, which means so many more women now feel comfortable participating in the economy, participating with public services, and being able to safely get out in the city. Next slide, please. We're also really looking at opportunities to bring in women where traditionally they haven't been able to be. And that means looking at senior management positions. And even in a very traditional society, bringing in women into jobs unheard of before, such as being drivers of the public transport. Next slide. Finally, on resilience, in our new project city in Karachi, you may be aware it is 11 months of the year a very dry desert. But 1 month of the year, we get extreme monsoons, which have been worsening over the past decade. This is the corridor that we will be constructing a new public transport system on. And every August, it looks like just like this. Next slide. So rather than a traditional drainage system, we found that to do something that is much more robust and resilient, we looked at some very progressive schemes in terms of what we call bioswales and retention cells. Basically, these are nature-based solutions to drainage that are actually more effective than more costly traditional measures. Next slide. Along our 28-kilometer corridor, we are putting in world-class pedestrian and bicycle ways. But we're going to marry this with permeable tiles and bioswales for drainage. And I love this slide because it really gets to, I think, the challenge that Michela put down, the previous speaker put down, is are there measures that bring accessibility and resilience together? And this is a universally accessible corridor that is also a sponge. And I think this really encapsulates the spirit of this event, which is trying to bring together both disability access and resilience. Next slide. We're even on this project putting in a grass strip in the middle of our busway lanes. This is an example from the US, but we'll be replicating this with our project in Karachi. Next slide. So it's been a pleasure to share with you a project that we are in Karachi breaking ground in about 40 days. So we're counting down to exciting times for us. And we do hope that this is one perspective on mapping a way forward for both inclusion and resilience. Thank you. Back to you, Asha.
Thank you, Lloyd. It's really, amazing what you can do in bringing resilience as well as sustainability as well as accessibility together. Um, I haven't been to Karachi for a number of years, but with the amount of population in South Asia, I can understand the problem that you have faced, and that might be one of the issues that maybe later on we can discuss the new metro system and how the role of persons with disabilities have been in bringing this project about. Thank you so much. The next speaker is again who gives us another best practice is Asi Radhya Nitya, Program Officer of Urban Resilience Initiative of Kota. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Asha. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Joining you here from Jakarta, I'm Asira Nitya from Kota Kita. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the left here, we have a picture of one alley in Pekalongan City, where the eternal flood has reached up to half of the house door and completely covered the front yard of the house. It will be very challenging for disabled groups to continue living in the area. And while on the picture on the right here, through a research project with GDI Hub, we met a deaf online motorcycle ride hailing driver. And the spontaneous heavy rains that comes more often than before has affected his working hour and income, as he's using a hearing aid that is more prone to wire damage. And despite the stark difference between climate condition of the two pictures, these two pictures shows how persons with disabilities will be the one most affected, having the least access and multiple barriers to basic needs, emergency support, and opportunity. Next slide, please. Okay. Despite the efforts to mitigate the climate crisis, disabled groups are often left out from the planning and design process of these initiatives. Take public transport as an example, which has been adopted by many cities as one of the solutions to urban resilience, as well as electric vehicle. But is it also inclusive? And one of the examples that I'm bringing from Indonesia here is a picture of Batik Trans Solo, the newly revamped public transport in Solo City. However, the new design of the bus stop, despite being more available in more stops in areas, have a different platform height from the bus and restricting the access for people with physical disabilities. Based on our research with GDI previously, in Solo, only 52% of people with disabilities have used public transport. And the reason was due to safety and accessibility issues. The lack of infrastructure and passenger information system barricade the disabled groups from accessing the city on their own. And what is not familiar with our current focus on individual impacts is that disabled groups are often villainized for not choosing these more sustainable options solely because they don't have the access to it. And in here, we also have a picture of Rumah Panggung or Stilt House in Banjarmasin, which is known as one of the most well-known and effective flood-adaptive solutions. Unfortunately, it isn't accessible for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. In here, you can see some pictures of the inclusive responses process in urban resilience that Kota Kita tried to always incorporate. For Kota Kita, we believe that inclusive responses in urban resilience efforts centers on meaningful citizen participation. And the first component to achieve this is data. And Kota Kita recognizes and advocates for the voices of all the citizens as data. And this data does not only come as hard statistics and numbers, but also the lived experience of vulnerable groups in the city and their needs. Second is participatory planning, in which disabled groups are the expert when it comes to access for people with disabilities. And they also have lived through the impact of climate crisis, and there will be no one who knows better when it comes to people with disabilities access and climate crisis impact other than them, which means their voices, needs, and aspirations must be mainstreamed and reflected in the design, planning, and development of resilient cities itself. While looking at the Batik Trans Solo cases, it does not always comes that way, but there are also some good examples like what Lloyd has presented before in Karachi. As of now, Kota does not have any projects specifically related to climate crisis, resilience, and people with disabilities, but we always incorporate inclusive participation in all projects. For example, in our current project, conducting a climate vulnerability assessment in dense neighborhood in Jakarta to understand their daily experiences of climate change. One of our focus is also to gather the data of voices and experiences unique to vulnerable groups, including people with disability. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, maybe just a quick wrap up from me on why disabled groups' perspective should always be included in resilience planning. It's because access for disabled groups equals access for all. And from our point of view, a city is not a resilient city if it does not cover and ensure the safety and livelihood of all of its residents. Hence, inclusive and climate responsive initiatives should go hand in hand. And this value of inclusivity should not be embedded through resilience, should be embedded through resilience and climate vulnerability planning and implementation. It can't be an add-on or an afterthought once the infrastructure or system have been built. And by incorporating the perspective of people with disabilities, we also increase the chance to prepare the population for changes that might happen in the future, because in climate crisis, we are not really sure where we are going. More research and intervention should be explored in this area as we work together to build more resilient and inclusive cities for all. Maybe that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Asi. Where persons with disability are concerned, I think you'll find that at COP also. Most usually what happens is with governments and with event departments that to bring in people who should be participating, who know much more than them about accessibility, is that this is a scientific thing, this is an engineering thing, so you will not know. These are common things that come, and you will see that at COP all the time, that this is only mitigation. We are talking about emissions. So, there are certain ideas and mindsets that are there, and I think those need to be removed. It's a great pleasure to invite Ben Olfrey, a research fellow between GDI Hub and the Institute of Making. He will bring to us a presentation on core benefits of local production for inclusive and sustainable futures. Ben, you
Great. Hi, yeah, thanks very much for having me. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about local production. And yeah, if I could go to the next slide, please. So just to start with, I'm just going to sort of jump it straight in and just look at some areas that we know need improvement for assistive technology provision and reducing environmental impact. So for assistive tech provision, we know there's a lack of aftercare services often. Even when devices are provided, users are not supported well afterwards. This leads to abandonment and distrust in the system. Supply is often not very stable. Again, people don't really trust the fact that they will have a device for life, and people who could benefit from AT don't want to risk becoming dependent on something that they can't trust they're always going to have. There's a lack of context-specific innovation. lots of designs of devices for urban settings, high income settings, and they're just not suitable for the majority of where people with disabilities are. Producing self-sustaining business models is very difficult. Okay. In terms of reducing environmental impact, there's a few things that we know need to happen. We need to have longer product lives. We need to retain value. We just need to be making less. We need to be shortening supply chains, reducing carbon footprint. We should be recovering materials and components where we can. And, you know, as we know, we just need to be recycling as much as we possibly can. Now, it seems like, why on earth would we try to address all of these things at once? It's too complicated. You can't, it's just too complex. But actually, possibly, when you really start to drill down on it, a lot of these are basically the same problem, and they could be from the same root causes, and they could have very similar solutions. And in particular, next slide, please. So we're interested in whether localization could help here. So let's just take a little look at what a common product life cycle for an assistive technology is. So often products are developed and produced overseas in high income settings. They're then shipped to where they're needed to be. Often there's some sort of fitting process, something has to happen in that local setting. And there might be some tracking for that initial period. Often, you know, provision models, they really only focus on this section of the product life. But actually what we do know is that for most AT, most of its useful life is through repair and maintenance. But that repair and maintenance often is not facilitated by the AT system. It might be done by informal workers, unspecialists, and it's just, it's not as done as well as it could be. In terms of product end of life, there's just it's not planned. It can't be taken advantage of. And it's very hard to change this in this model because this value chain is so spread out across the world. It's hard to integrate that value chain. It's too far apart. Next slide, please. So, I mean, an alternative to this could be, you know, if we had local product development, you know, this brings the potential for context-specific innovation. Production in a local setting could engage with consumers, learn from them. The actual fitting can be very close to production. The supply chains are shorter. It's less likely to be unstable. Repair is much easier to achieve. I mean, if you've got the expertise of those producers and availability of spare parts, then that can facilitate repair. You know, when manufacturers are far away on another continent, there's no benefit to them to design something with repair in mind. That's not part of their model. But if repair could be part of a business model for a manufacturer, then it leads to designs that could facilitate that repair. You know, if production is occurring in a local setting, then there's the possibility of integrating product end of life into the rest of the value chain. You know, you can be taking components, materials, bringing them back round and using them again in production. You can't do that if everything is spread out all over the world. There's also quite strong relationships between design for repair and design for upgrade in terms of modularity, and design for disassembly. So actually, all of these things they encourage each other. Next slide, please. Well, That said, I mean, there are huge problems that need solving in order to achieve this. I mean, quality assurance is hard. It's hard to achieve. There are very strong reasons why global supply chains and mass manufacture has a monopoly. Quality is good. It's cheap. Trying to create economically viable business models is hard in a local setting because you have to create the entire ecosystem in itself. Building the needed capacity and skills. There's a lack of trust in locally made devices in a lot of settings, and that's a hard thing to overcome. We also need to be identifying what AT is really suitable for local manufacturing and what isn't. Next slide, please. So one example of some work that we're doing in this area with the AT Impact Fund is with Wazi Vision. So Wazi Vision is an eyeglasses company in Uganda. And in Uganda currently, I mean, all eyeglasses they're imported. They're imported into Uganda at high cost. There's not designs for the local consumers. It's for, everything's designed for this supposed global consumer, okay? And this really doesn't help with stigma associated with eyeglasses. And we've been working with Wazi to develop local manufacturing capacities for eyeglasses, starting with a great design competition from local consumers for Afrocentric design. By locally producing the eyeglasses there, it means that you can be using local materials, and you can consider further engagement with clients like repair or replacing components. And that consumer engagement is something that global supply chains can't offer. You can't achieve everything if these things are all made overseas. There has to be more models involved in the system rather than just the one based on global supply chains. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben. Inclusivity in any of these issues is so very important, and especially of local people, because one of the things that is something that we always question is who made those decisions, where were they made, who helped in the production. There are two questions in the chat box. Will you go first, Lloyd? Have you found an accessible way for people to tackle it to get on the bus?
Well, thank you. The question is, what about potential conflicts between persons with disabilities or pedestrians in general with cyclists? Because very often in cities, we put those two infrastructures side by side, and we do know that they're traveling at different speeds. So I just want to first say that we address this with sort of two different physical solutions. So if we are allowing persons with disabilities or pedestrians to cross, say, a high traffic or very wide road, such as an expressway, our solution would be, before we get to the outside cycleway, we would actually provide a grade separated way, meaning we would provide an elevator or in many cases a ramp to provide either an elevated or underground crossing. Now, generally, though, persons with disabilities and pedestrians in general would prefer not to do that. They would prefer to be able to cross the street very directly because of the extra effort, or depending on that elevator to actually be working. There's a lot of factors there. So on more residential roadways or where it's safe to do so, we cross at grade, and then it becomes a question of how do we cross that cycleway where we have bicycles going back and forth, how do we do that in a safe way? And generally, we provide one visual cues to the cyclists. So that's meaning signage and road markings to let cyclists know that we have people crossing. And we can also provide even some changes in the texture of the pavement to do that. I'll just finish by saying, I know that was sort of a wonky way to answer your question, but you know, cyclists, pedestrians, and person with disabilities, they're all our friends. I mean, they're all supporting sustainable mobility. And we want to avoid any situation where our friends are in conflict. So we do work very hard to make sure that cyclists have a safe space in the city, but not at the expense of pedestrians and persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. I think we've lost Asha off the call. So I was maybe going to ask Ben if you could answer the question in the chat, which was about how we deal with copyright in the kind of ideas you talked about.
Yeah, it's a really important point because you know, digital fabrication and innovation is one of the drivers of increasing distributed manufacturing. I mean, it enables making of complex devices in local settings that just previously wasn't possible. You know, it's democratizing innovation. You know, you no longer need a very expensive R&D department to be able to innovate, and that's great. And design sharing is great, but you know, people, you know, profit models are really important, and yeah, people have a right to be able to protect their designs, and it's a really hard problem, and I don't think it's been solved properly. The link between open source design, but also facilitating profit-driven models. I'm sorry, I don't know what the Marrakesh treatment is, but in terms of, yeah, I think for accessible prints and the other options that you bring in with digital innovations is that, you know, there's a huge potential there for adaptable designs. If people can be sharing various types of designs that are adaptable to different contexts, it means that innovation doesn't have to start from scratch all over again. And then I'm just reading another. How can supply chains complement local production to making AT provision sustainable? Yeah, I think like it is all about like a combination of overseas. Yes, okay. Well, I think it's identifying what bits are absolutely best done through mass manufacture. There are certain components that they don't need to be customized, and therefore, most likely, mass manufacture is the best route to producing cheap goods, as long as the supply chains are stable enough. You know, in some other work that we were doing, we do know that one of the gaps is in just a lack of regional distribution networks. Often the clinics are organizing their own supply, which means that there's not really any buying power. There's no efficiency in it. So yeah, identifying what should be mass produced and then identifying what is best done locally and combining those two things together. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we just have a couple of seconds left. I wish we had more time to bring on the other panelists. There's one thing that we have to remember, that for example, in climate change and biodiversity, the use of certain items are not allowed, or supposed not to be, that it does much more harm to the climate itself. So that is something that is called, it goes against resilience. Michaela, would you like to sum up, to say a few words before we close?
Sure, I'll make it very brief as we are at the end of our time, but I think we just wanted to say thank you so much to Asha Hans for being our chair today, and thank you to all of our speakers. It was so great to hear from all of the presentations from Pakistan to Kenya to Indonesia, and it's made us, I think, really excited about the future of this direction of work. And before we close, we just wanted to invite everyone to join us at our side event at COP26, which will be on the 11th of November 2021 from 9:30 to 11 in the morning. It will be streamed live on YouTube via the official COP channels, but we will also be streaming it from our website directly. So you'll be able to find it there, and we will share the link with all of the participants from today. We also just wanted to say that you can read all of our inclusive design case studies online. Some of them are still in production, but the ones that are available at 802030.org. If you have any further questions, please do get in touch with us at GDI Hub, and we'd be delighted to continue the conversation with you. So thanks very much, everybody, and have a great day.